Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله
Today we
وبركاته.
have Tim Mackintosh-Smith. He is well known for his travel writing. For a long time he has been exploring the history of Muslims and the Arabs, and especially he was traveling through the land of Ibn Battuta. He was taking the footsteps of Ibn Battuta and exploring it. Let's hear from him about the communities, how they changed maybe from 14th century to the current time. So we'll start from the Mashriq, maybe the land of Ibn Battuta. Then how you feel, because you have gone through the 14th century literature very much. Then you visited the places, how do you see the differences? How was the experience?
Well, you say how places have changed, but also a lot of places haven't changed. And really that's what I was exploring. I was exploring the effect of time. And you might say my book is about place, but in fact it's more about time. It's a kind of book of time travel. And I think by following somebody from the past like that, you can actually take away the dimension, the three dimensions that we move in, and you can focus more on the dimension of time. Does that make sense? It sounds a bit sort of airy-fairy to begin our conversation, but following in somebody's footsteps, you have your route already planned. You know where you're going. There aren't any surprises. The surprises are in what you discover along the way and in the effect of time upon them.
Yeah, that's great. Because a small child, he by hearted Quran, and then he started his journey for Hajj. Then he took a long way to different pathways, and then he ended up the Hajj, and then he started another journey, and there were different journeys. And I'm thinking, how is the difference between the continents? Because let us describe about what the things you have seen there in, especially in Africa. Let's concentrate on Africa.
Ibn Battuta himself was, of course, African. He came from the Maghreb, from Morocco, from Tangier, as it's called in English. He would have felt himself not an African as we talk about today. He was part of that very wide Islamic Arabic community. I mean, in fact, he was actually ethnically Amazigh. But in culture, in upbringing, he was totally Arabized. So that's, he belonged to that huge and growing culture of Islam, or Arab Islam, and Islam, of course, being infused with Arab and Arabic culture. So he wouldn't have thought of himself as African as such, even though he physically came from that continent. And he didn't actually travel in what we think of as sub-Saharan Africa until the end of his travels, where he actually had a fascinating time. I mean, should I talk about his adventures? There's a theory that he might have been sent by Abu Inan, who was the Sultan of Morocco at the time, as a kind of spy, or at least an intelligence gatherer, and he went to what was then the Empire of Mali. Okay, and Mali, the Empire of Mali, was quite a lot bigger than the country of Mali is today. Of course, they share a name, but he crossed the desert, the Sahara, and had many adventures crossing the desert, and ended up, his first sort of major stop was a place called Walata, which is today in Mauritania. And well, I have very, very vivid memories of Walata, and I'll tell you a story.
Great.
I went there at the end of a very long journey. I went to Nouakchott, the capital of Mauritania, and they just had a coup d'etat. So it was all a bit in turmoil, and there were army checkpoints and lots of problems along the way. And eventually I got to a place called Ni'ma, which means blessing in Arabic. It seemed to be not very well named. It was a bit at the end of the asphalt road. And then from there, I crossed the desert to Walata. And you know how people talk about Timbuktu as being kind of at the end of the earth or the most distant place you can imagine. No, Walata is like that. And I know Mauritanians who've never been there, and people who study Mauritania who've never been to Walata. So eventually I got there in the middle of the night and found somewhere to lay my head. And the next day, they said, "Oh, you know, what brings you here?" And I said, "Well, I'm following in the footsteps of Ibn Battuta. I'm studying history and time and everything else." And they said, "Oh, you better meet our great scholar, who was from a family called al-Mahjubi." And this is a bit of a long anecdote. You don't mind?
Yeah,
it's okay?
please,
Yeah.
let's hear that.
Well, so they took me through these narrow streets with these fantastic mud houses with painted doorways. I mean, it really is an amazing place.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to hear.
Oh yeah, no, it's like you're in a different world.
Yeah.
And eventually we got to this kind of mud citadel, and up we went, and I was led into the room of Muhammad al-Mahjubi, and he was in bed. So, you know, I felt, I said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry to bother you," and he kind of woke up and said, "You know, what brings you here?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a study of Ibn Battuta, so I wanted to come to Walata." And he looked at me like thunder, and he said, Ibn Battuta, lam ya'ti ila huna." He never came here. And I kind of, well, I was totally crestfallen. Here's the chief of the place and the main historian, and there he was actually denying that Ibn Battuta had ever been there. And anyway, all right, so I kind of changed the subject, and we talked about manuscripts and history in general, and kept off the subject of Ibn Battuta. But to cut a long story short, I met another scholar of the town and said, I was very surprised because, you know, Ibn Battuta writes in his book that he went to Walata, etc. And the other scholar laughed, and he said, "Well, yes, he did come here, but do you remember the bit where he visits the judge? And the judge has a young and beautiful lady. And Ibn Battuta says, 'Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were with your wife.' And the judge says, 'She's not my wife. Hiya sadiqati. She is my female friend.' And Ibn Battuta goes into this rant and says, 'Oh, you know, you're a judge. You should not have a female friend, etc., etc.' Ibn Battuta was a bit old-fashioned about things like that. But again, to cut an even longer story short, the judge was the ancestor of the guy I first met, and the family is still angry about what Ibn Battuta wrote 660 years ago. They're still angry.
Yeah.
So
it's great to know that you met the person in the same family after 600 years.
Oh, absolutely, and he's by no means the only one. Really, my journey started. It started in Sana'a in Yemen, where I've lived for many, many years. You know, almost 40 years, and I still think of it as home. I'm not there at the moment, but it started with realizing that one of my oldest and best friends there was a direct descendant in the male line of Ibn Battuta's host in Yemen.
Oh, great.
And,
it's interesting.
So, yeah, and it was because of Hassan, Dr. Hassan, this friend. And the way I wrote about it, I said it was like, if you can imagine standing on a cliff, looking over the edge of the cliff, and the cliff is a cliff of time. And in one jump, you could fly off the cliff and get back to the past.
Oh.
And it's really moments like that I have been trying to recreate.
I think we have to go back to Africa because before we come to this part of Asia.
Yeah.
So I want to check that, because you are British, then you are called as an Arabist, maybe a post-Orientalist. Yourself like to be known, that post-Orientalist. I want to check with you, how do you feel that the journey of Ibn Battuta to the Mali Empire, because it was very affluent at the time, and maybe they had GDP of the high of all the time, the long back time. So how do you see this, the Orientalist view towards Africa and the narrative of Ibn Battuta and later your travel?
How do I see
this Oriental narrative, the new narratives on Africa?
The new narratives on Africa as in today.
Yeah.
How does it fit into the history?
Yeah.
Well, I think you have to do a kind of complete mind switch, if the word exists, and say, as you pointed out, that the Empire of Mali had an enormous GDP. It was a tremendously rich country, and the reason was that it controlled the flow out of gold. So all the gold that was going to North Africa and a lot of the Arab world and into Europe, it was controlled by Mali. And so we had the example of Mansa Musa. The rulers were called Mansa. Mansa Musa famously, before Ibn Battuta went there, Mansa Musa went on the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he gave out so much gold along the way that the price of gold plummeted.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of think of sub-Saharan Africa, or at least that bit of it, as an absolute center of economic power.
Yeah, this also connects the African's nature of traveling for Hajj. Ibn Battuta also famous, or he intended to travel for Hajj. Mansa Musa is also, his narrative always maybe in depth in his journey to Mecca and spending gold coins over the way. So how do you see this kind of African nature of traveling?
Well, it's part of the genius of Islam, or the whole point of Islam, that it brings people together from everywhere. And you might say that at the heart of Christianity, people break bread together. They share a meal together, the Eucharist or the Holy Communion. But in Islam, people travel together. And travel is raised to a kind of sacred level. I mean, all right, talk about Christianity. Of course, pilgrimage is a big thing for Christianity too, but there's something even more, I think, in Islam, because there is that strong focus on going to Mecca. And Mecca is the home of the house of God, the Kaaba. Some accounts have even, I don't think they're canonical accounts, but they suggest that, I think there's a story that when God was creating the earth, he kind of spread it out from Mecca. So it's kind of like the navel of the earth, if that makes sense. And really going there is sort of a homecoming, as I understand it. And it brings people together, and then it sends them back home. So, for example, where was I?
Yeah, actually,
I'm just trying to think physically, where was I? And there was actually a sort of
traveling for Hajj, especially.
Yeah, no, but I'm trying to remember the name of the place. It wasn't Niagasola. It was somewhere around the borders of Mali and Guinea, and I visited a village which was still home to many descendants of those old Mansas, or emperors of Mali, and they had a sacred house there, and I said, "Oh, can I go in?" And they said, "No, you can't." And so I said, "Well, what's inside it?" And they wouldn't tell me. But I since found out that it was, if you like, souvenirs from the pilgrimage to Mecca
Yeah, great.
of, I believe it was Mansa Suleiman or maybe Mansa Musa or maybe Mansa Suleiman. So some of that qadasa, that sacredness, that sanctity, was brought back home from the pilgrimage.
Oh, that's wonderful.
You know, it doesn't matter if you're African, it doesn't matter if you're from China or wherever you're from, but you all take part in this, you all share in this sanctity.
Yeah, then you have the book Arabs, 3,000 Years of Travel, or the people, the tribe, the communities, and you are talking about all the things. So how do you see that, because we were talking about the Africans. Is it in a wider perspective of the Arabs, African is different, or how do you see this?
People who've written histories of Arabs, and I specifically say Arabs rather than the Arabs, which tends to make them sound as if they're one kind of limited, homogeneous group. People who've written Arab histories before, they tend to say things like, oh, the Arabs came onto the stage of world history with the beginning of Islam, and of course it's much, much older than that. The first actual Arab was mentioned in an Assyrian inscription of, I think, 853 BC. So the historical written record goes back before Islam as long as it is after Islam. So that's how I tended to look at Arab history, with Islam as being the central point, not the beginning of things. But, also other people have tended to fixate on the futuhat, those original expansions, the founding of the Arab Islamic Empire, which took place in early Islamic times. But what I've tried to do more, and it's partly because I have traveled with Ibn Battuta and kind of witnessed the effects of this, is to look at what I would call the later commercial, cultural futuhat, the openings literally it means, but the expansion of Arabic Islamic culture that took place particularly in Ibn Battuta's time. So you can look at the 7th century AD and the 8th century, and you can see, Arabs bursting out from here, from the Arabian Peninsula, and getting as far as China and Spain. But in Ibn Battuta's time, they were going further. And you can look at, say, those two great trading oceans, the Indian Ocean and the Sahara. And I class the Sahara, if you like, as an ocean. It's kind of an ocean of sand that you have to cross, but around it are all these settlements around Mali and going into East Africa and so on. And around the Indian Ocean, of course, we have all the settlements from East Africa round to what's now Indonesia, Java, and so on. And really the map of the Islamic world took shape as it is today in the time of Ibn Battuta. And with it went Arabic culture. So Arabs, from being a very small group, whatever it meant right at the beginning, it probably meant people who lived in the desert and kept camels, and it became something much wider. So, obviously we have people who wouldn't call themselves Arab in Indonesia and in sub-Saharan Africa, but they're all infused with Arabic culture.
That's great. I think we will end this episode with how the African, because he's an African, really, he was seeing the world in the eyes of African. How do you describe that?
How Ibn Battuta was seeing the world.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, he wouldn't have thought of himself as an African as we think of today. The notions of a continent of Africa were not there. He saw himself as a Muslim of Arab culture from if you like, from the far edge of the known world. And you know, you can take the Americas off the map and so on, and Australasia and so on. If you came from Tangier, on the Straits of Gibraltar, right at the top end corner of Africa, at the end of Europe, with nothing but the circumambient ocean around you, you really came from the end of the world. So he was looking inward, and he looked inward to the center of things at Mecca, which is, you know, why he went on his pilgrimage, of course. But then, after going on the pilgrimage, he put into literal practice that famous hadith, or saying of the Prophet Muhammad, you know, seek knowledge even if the journey takes you to China. So, you know, he literally did go to China, and he went there as a knowledge seeker. And I think, how did he see things? I mean, really, he saw things as a kind of, how can I put it? The great thing about Ibn Battuta was that he wasn't too clever. He wasn't a great scholar. He had quite a simple mind, but he had a very observant eye, and he had a brilliant memory. So in effect, he was the perfect observer. And there's a lot of naivety in his account. You know, some things, sometimes he's depicted as this great, heroic explorer and everything else. No, he wasn't really like that. He was an observer, an absorber of information. He was putting into practice that hadith I talked about, go to China, and also there are all those verses in the Quran which say things like, oh, do they not go about the earth and see what has become of those before them? So he was doing that as well. And the fact that he was a bit of a blank canvas made him the perfect observer. In his time, he got back to Morocco, and a lot of people said, oh, who's this upstart? He never really got very far in his studies, and he talks about all these weird kings and sultans that he met who showered people with gold, but he really doesn't know much in the way of standard book knowledge. But what he was doing was looking at creation, and I would say, in theological terms, because you asked, you know, how he was seeing things, I think he was, perhaps at the heart of it, he was trying to understand the Creator by looking at creation.
Thank you so much for this, and we will end this episode because next episode we will go to the other part of the world, especially we will explore Europe and Asia further. So thank you so much for being with me.
It's a great pleasure.